Well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us this Thursday, April 22nd, for the Small Business Briefing. I'm Rob Fowler. I'm the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan, and I'm joined by Brian Calley, the president of SBAM, for this briefing. And this briefing is brought to you by Health Screen. I had an opportunity actually last week. We held an in-person board meeting, and we used Health Screen to screen all the participants in that board meeting. It was a couple of days, so each morning I got a text. I answered a couple of questions, and I was given clearance to go to the meeting. Simple, easy, and documented. If you want to find out more, you can find out more at healthycomply.com. Brian, it is Earth Day, and I think we should acknowledge that. We'll talk about it a little bit later in this briefing, but happy Earth Day.
Yeah, happy Earth Day. And, let's say I actually read a really nice, I grabbed it for the comments. I read a nice op-ed piece by Congressman Fred Upton today for Earth Day, and really making the case that we don't have to pick between a good business environment and a good environment. Like that, these aren't mutually exclusive. I thought he made a great case for that. Of course, anybody who watches this briefing would be familiar with Congressman Upton. He's been on this briefing many times. Great friend to SBAM.
Well, we'll talk about it a little bit later, because there's the policy choices, but there's also some very practical things to do, and so we'll come back to that. Well, let's start with it's not Data Monday as we call it, but we've been really tracking the numbers, because I do think we are at a critical point in the trends of the coronavirus, what's happening. You've sort of been making a projection that we're at the peak, near the peak. What are you thinking now in terms of the peak?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like we reached the peak last week. So you never can tell for sure till you're looking backward at it. There's some sense that, last time in the fall, there were a couple of, for a couple of weeks, it went down a little bit, and then it leveled off for a couple of weeks, and then it really dropped down quite a bit lower. So far, though, we don't see any sign of a slow decline. It looks actually pretty steep, the decline that we see happening so far. Just looking at the numbers yesterday, the 7-day average, you might recall that it was over 7,000 cases per day. As of yesterday, it was 5,744. So it had dropped down quite a bit. We see the hospitalization still really high statewide, about the census about 3,900 inpatients, but that had hit about 4,000, almost 4,300 before. So it has come down, but that's still a really high level. ICU inpatients have been really high too, basically matching or exceeding by a little bit the fall numbers but the percent positive continues to be on a glide path down, and that's what gives me the most confidence that the numbers are going to keep on going down, that the situation will continue to get better, because we see the percent positive going down, and the average testing has been way up. So throughout the beginning of this year, there are about 42 or 43,000 tests a day. For the last week, it's been over 60,000 tests per day. So that gives me more confidence that we have a complete picture, a very substantially complete picture of what's happening with the virus, because the testing has been so robust during this time period. So cases have still come down. More testing, a lot of times that'll drive the number of cases you find up. More testing in this case, but cases still went down. So I think it's all good signs. Still high, still critical point, but I would say overall, I'm very pleased. And I think what we had projected in the previous week, that we thought we were pretty much at our peak at that point, turns out that's true.
Well, it's part of the we've become data geeks a little bit, but part of the reason we're geeking out on this is because it drives the public policy decisions made by the governor and others. And so I guess it all leads us to the question: do you see more restrictions coming? But maybe more importantly, do you see less restrictions coming?
Yeah. So the big questions in front of us now really are about gatherings of people. Right now, those are limited indoor to 25, and then the office restrictions being really the two most restrictive measures that affect business. And I don't see any tightening up of any of those rules. In other words, I don't see any additional rules coming. I think that if that would have happened, it would have been 3 weeks ago when we're on our way up. When we're on our way down, on the numbers, there's a lot less pressure on the governor to take actions. So what about easing up on the rules? Probably not soon. I think it's fairly unlikely that we're going to see substantial changes in the months of April or May. I think probably June. That's not, and sometimes I say it's not inside information, but I maybe heard a little something here or there. In this case, it really is not inside information. I'm just kind of projecting. I'm looking at what happened in the fall. I'm looking at the pathway that I expect the numbers to go, and when they get low enough to when the governor and the Department of Health and Human Services have been comfortable in the past and backing off in some of the rules. And I really think we're looking at June, not May.
It's been fascinating to watch what other areas have done. Another reason, the reason to do that is also to sort of predict, if you will, what's going to happen in Michigan. Numbers are coming down, so we it's easy to see that we're. The question will be, what are the triggers for less restrictions? But I think there's a fascinating case study, right, at our as a neighbor. It's actually the neighbor to the north. It's Ontario, Canada. They implemented some new restrictions and then got some pretty serious blowback from their citizens. We
did see Ontario, which is the province just over the Detroit River. I mean, it's kind of around the north and the east of Michigan in Canada. Actually, to a little bit to the south of us too, depending.
Yeah, it is. That's true.
But anyway, they were pretty heavy restrictions, including like stuff like closing down playgrounds and then having law enforcement officers stop and question people, why are you out? And so it's pretty aggressive action. And there was serious blowback. The premier in Ontario, which would be like our governor, so it's called a premier in Canadian provinces, backed off on those rules pretty quickly. And so even though Canada actually has had some trouble as of late with pandemic management, and they had kept their numbers pretty low for a while, but had been on the rise, and they were taking pretty aggressive action, and the Canadian people pushed back pretty hard, and so the policymakers ended up pulling back on that. I think as you look around what's happening in our country, including what's happening right here in this state, that I do think that the decisions being made are through that lens of there's only so much people are going to accept, and being a little bit more realistic or pragmatic about that. And so I'm hopeful that keeps up, especially when you consider the type of pathway that we're on with vaccinations already to a point where supply is starting to exceed demand.
So speaking of Canada, for those, again, maybe it's another sign of where we are today, the heavily restricted Canadian and Mexican border crossing for people and for business. There was just some news recently about that Canadian and Mexican border crossing. What do we know?
Yeah, so those restrictions that have been in place for a long time now, I mean, basically since the beginning of this pandemic, they've been extended out to May 21st. And although that was somewhat notable, that was kind of a short-term extension. And I wondered if that might be a sign that even though there are still hot spots, there's still some trouble with pandemic management in different areas, and definitely around the world. Some of them are right in the middle of it, the most difficult time they've had so far. But in our country, where vaccination progress has been so substantial and so fast, relative to most of the world, I wonder if that was a signal that maybe they are considering loosening up on some of the North American restrictions in terms of back and forth in the border. I might be reading a little too much into that, but extending that out to May 21st, that's not really that far away. And it told me that perhaps they're envisioning something different for the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's another signal to watch. It's interesting on its own, but you mix it together with what's happening with cases and hospitalizations and other things. It does seem like that's at least a positive signal that it was such a short-term extension. We've been talking about vaccines, so let's continue on that. We sort of obsess about vaccines, I guess, because we think it's the key to getting back to normal, whatever that's going to look like. As I saw the data yesterday, one of the things that's, I think, curious and maybe concerning is the numbers of shots in arms has decreased pretty dramatically in this last few days. And I think it probably tells us, or you tell me, is that a sign of just decreasing demand for vaccines?
We are at the point where supply is still increasing, demand really leveled off. It looks like maybe the week before last. And last week was the first time in a long time that since the beginning, that we saw the shots administered actually go down week over week. So this week lower than the previous week. Didn't quite get up to that 100 doses a week or average 7-day average of 100 doses a day.
100,000.
I'm sorry, 100,000 doses a day.
Yeah.
Struggle with my numbers here today. We didn't quite hit it. Remember in the Merck reports from last Monday that we got to about 90,000 on average per day, and that dropped down some. And it's mostly in first doses administered. Right. So that's where we saw the drop off, and that tells me that demand has ebbed a bit, and that is not unique for Michigan. We're actually seeing that across the entire country. One thing that really did I don't know if for sure that it's related, but I think it's plausible that the drop off in demand for vaccines coincided with the federal government's decision to pause Johnson & Johnson vaccines. And I think that you got some people that want the vaccine no matter what. And you've got others that they're not really against it, but not really totally sure. And then you have some people that are just totally against vaccines. So I think that middle group is heavily influenced by that abundance of caution move that the federal government made, and I just think that may have had an impact on overall demand. So it's gonna I think it takes some work to win people over, because we're still a ways off from anything that looks like herd immunity.
Well, I do think a lot of people, we distinguish between Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, but I think a lot of people think of it as the vaccine, and they either are concerned about it or they're not. And you're right, that probably doesn't help any. It looks like Johnson & Johnson's moving forward with their rollout in other places across the world, I guess. Not yet here in the United States, right? Yeah.
So we saw in Europe, they restarted. They looked at all the same data that the U.S. is looking at right now and said, the extremely rare side effects are so insignificant compared to the risk of the virus itself that they're full speed ahead with that vaccine. We heard last weekend, Dr. Fauci expected yet this week, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, that there would be a decision from our federal government on what to do in terms of this short-term abundance of caution pause on Johnson & Johnson vaccines. And remember, that's the one that is going to be really important for those who have mobility issues, and the idea of having two separate shots coordinated over 3 or 4 weeks is very challenging. The Johnson & Johnson, just one shot. So there's a lot of our population where that's going to be really, really important for us to hit those thresholds of 70% or more of our population vaccinated.
And then I think China is another sort of vaccine story to watch. They've been experimenting a little bit with, as I understand it, mixing up the the producers, they have their own providers of vaccinations. What are you listening for in China?
It's a really interesting and I thought very insightful outcome in China. Normally, they're very guarded about these things. I wonder if it was accidentally released. Their main domestically produced vaccine is only 50% effective, and I think that goes to show how truly remarkable it is that Moderna and Johnson and Johnson and Pfizer are so highly effective, unusually effective. It could have turned out a different way, and it appears to be what has happened in China. So they are now looking at combining it with other types of vaccines to try and get that effectiveness increased. So that'll be kind of a real-time research project that's happening, but ultimately, China and India are two countries where both have over 1 billion people that live in them. It's going to take a long time for them to do the same thing that we're able to do in a relatively short period of time here in the United States. And so that still increases our risk, right? When the virus is rampant elsewhere, the idea of future generations of this virus that are called variants escaping the effectiveness of our vaccines, that goes up. So I'm watching India close, I'm watching Brazil close, I'm watching China close as well, and this approach that China is taking in testing the effectiveness of mixing vaccinations together to increase the effectiveness is something that I think the whole world has a stake in.
Good. So moving on from the sort of the data, one of the implications of this has been a discussion in Washington about a national set of OSHA standards, occupational safety and health standards, that would probably preempt state, in our case, my OSHA standards, or potentially become even more restrictive. Most of what employers now are dealing with in terms of workplace come from my OSHA. What are you hearing in Washington about national standards and the likelihood of a sort of national movement?
A couple of months ago, they were basically saying they're coming, get ready. We are going to have a federal standard that everybody's going to have to meet. And whether it was higher or lower than any individual state, it was a good bet that they would be different. It would be more disruption. They could be conflicting. Whose rules do I follow? That type of a scenario. And but we were told from a lot of different sources, expect this. It's coming. They're reviewing it. They've got drafts. I mean, all that stuff that sounded like it was right on the cusp, and then nothing. And then weeks later pass, and nothing is released. Now there is some talk I've heard from a source anyway, but a well-placed one, that that they're leaning against having a federal OSHA set of COVID-19 rules. We live in Michigan where we have like local state OSHA offices where the state is really empowered to enforce the federal and the state rules. That's actually not the common way that it's done. And I think that the federal government was faced with this, like, wow, if we put these OSHA standards out there, and in most states, they're federal regulators and federal enforcers, not state like it is in Michigan. How is the federal government going to pull that off? And I think that they may have come to the conclusion that they can't. Yeah. And if they can't, then don't cause the disruption. States have been handling this all the way along. Why change it up right at the very end? So I'm hopeful. I know that we were pretty concerned that we would have conflicting rules, that we'd have a whole new regulation regime that would come in. And every day that it doesn't happen, I think that it improves the chances that it won't happen.
Good. Yeah, and I think early on it was driven by states that really hadn't done many of the things that the state of Michigan has done. Like it or not, we were about to become the victim of other states not having moved very, very far in this. Let's move on to, we've been kind of tracking Unlock Michigan. Unlock Michigan was an effort to gather enough signatures to put onto the ballot, essentially an overturn of the 1945 Riot Act, the source of the powers the governor used early on in this pandemic that was struck down by the Supreme Court. But the effort continued to try to just get it off the books. A flurry of activity actually in the last 24, 48 hours on that issue.
Usually when citizens petition the government to get a law repealed, there's a process called a citizens initiative in our Constitution. You have to collect a lot of signatures, hundreds of thousands of signatures, in order to put a question either to the legislature or to the voters. And in this case, there were, turns out, 460,000 valid signatures collected. That was a determination that the Secretary of State has made, which is way more than what is required to repeal the section of law that gave the governor the original emergency powers to essentially make law unilaterally, and to do it for an indefinite period of time. And so that determination was a long time coming. So they turned in the signatures last year, but there's nothing that said that the Secretary of State had to do a review of the signatures in any particular period of time. Usually it happens in 6 to 8 weeks. In this case, it was like 4 or 5 months. So I think that she really did kind of push it out as long as she possibly could. But the signatures were valid. So you'd think, okay, so now the question goes to the legislature. They can either adopt or reject. If they adopt, then it's done. If they reject, then it goes on the ballot for the citizens to decide. And but the first thing it has to do is go through the Board of Canvassers. And the Board of Canvassers, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, a very, very partisan process. And oftentimes there's a 2-2 vote, even though the Secretary of State has certified this, or the Secretary of State has recommended certification of the signatures. The 2 Democrats voted no, and the 2 Republicans voted yes to certify the signatures and send it through the process. And so it'll go to court from here. There is no basis not to certify it. It's what you call a slam dunk. It has been the whole time. Whether you agree or disagree with what it does, there's no question whatsoever that it meets the standards in the Constitution to move forward. So it'll win. It'll just be another step of a court forcing the Board of Canvassers, compelling them to certify the signatures and send it off to the legislature. At that point, it's highly likely that the legislature would simply adopt it, and it essentially becomes law at that point without the governor's signature. It's just an intricacy of our Constitution, in a way that questions can be put before, to change the law, can be put before the legislature and enacted into law without the governor's signature.
And without the governor's ability to veto.
Right. Yeah. So there is no veto of this. If the signatures are certified, which they will be after court action, it'll go to the legislature. If they pass it, which they probably will, then there is no veto. You'd have to propose a brand new law and send it through the whole process, or start a citizens initiative, just like that one did,
Yes.
And have it changed. But there is no veto. In this case, it totally sidesteps the governor.
All right. Yesterday, I think a little bit to our surprise, to a lot of people's surprise, a new tax credit was introduced by the Biden administration. I think, I'm not sure what the process was. I think they used some existing authority to announce the credit and the budget of the American Recovery Act to fund it, but a new tax credit.
Yeah, so how this tax credit works, and they were supposed to, I think today, or maybe it was yesterday, have the rules out on it. But basically it's a credit to cover the cost of paid time off for employees to get a vaccine. So give the employee the day off or the afternoon off or whatever to go get a vaccine. If you do that paid time off, then when you file your quarterly taxes, you can claim the cost up to $511. I'm not exactly sure where that number comes from, but $511 is the max that could be claimed in this credit, and only for organizations with fewer than 500 employees. So this is a new thing that looks like it was well, it definitely uses the American Rescue Plan dollars in order to fund it, but in terms of the mechanism, in terms of what state or what law they rely on to do it, it wasn't totally clear to me in the announcement here. But we've seen this before, where they're looking for certain actions to be taken or mandating certain actions. You might recall in the very beginning of the pandemic, there were paid leave requirements that were added to employers, and they said, but you can claim it against your quarterly withholding filings and get it refunded sooner. So that looks like what they're doing here too.
All right. Hey, I mentioned earlier that it's Earth Day, and I guess I've always heard that the best sort of energy conservation is energy that's never consumed in the first place. And I think on a super practical level, our contribution to this whole thing has been an energy conservation effort. And Kyle Richards is our resident expert on this, runs our Small Business Energy Solutions program. And Kyle, on this Earth Day, I thought maybe it'd be appropriate to have you come on and talk just a little bit about what our program is.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, happy Earth Day, and just a few kind of tips and tricks you can use that cost maybe little to nothing. One is just run the program on your thermostat. I've done hundreds of energy assessments at businesses, and a lot of times I go in there and I see a little hold on the thermostat, which just means it's maintaining that temperature 24/7 until that's turned off. And when you run the program on your thermostat, it'll lower the temperature when you leave and then bring it up when you get back. There's no reason to heat or cool a space that you're not in. Another thing is just put some pipe wrap on your hot water pipes. It saves a little bit, but it's actually more convenient because the water, when it gets to the faucet, is actually hot sooner. So you don't have to wait as long to run the water, spend less on water, also spend less on water treatment charges. So it's a twofold. Doors and window seals. Those are the places where the air escapes in the building the most. So just making sure those seals are nice and solid, and you can buy pipe wrap and window door seals at any hardware store, and it's fairly inexpensive. Changing your filters on your furnace, again, it should be done twice a year at minimum. Healthy air, get people in the building. It keeps people healthy, but also helps your air conditioner and your furnace run a lot smoother and a lot longer. And then two more things: install LED lighting and install motion sensors in rooms that aren't used as often as, let's say, a hallway or something like that. So those are just some quick, easy ways to save some money. And then finally, if you kind of don't know where to start, what to do, get a hold of us. We'll do an energy assessment free of charge. I'll come to your facility and I'll point out those things, and I'll help you find contractors and ways to save money elsewhere. So again, happy Earth Day. I appreciate you letting me come on, and in the chat, you can get the website and sign up for an energy assessment there.
Kyle, our partners in this are DTE Energy and Consumers Energy, and we appreciate their helping to fund this. And it always seems like a little bit ironic that those providers of energy are the ones helping to fund this. Can you just explain what may seem to a business owner as a disconnect?
Yeah, so this is a common question I get, and it's pretty simple math. So Consumers and DTE, they have these giant central power stations, and they cost billions of dollars to build and run. If they can help us save $100 a year, $1,000 a year, $10,000 a year, whatever it might be, later on they have to build smaller power plants, and therefore costing us less in energy and all that stuff. And as we move towards renewable energy, they can build smaller renewable energy sources as well. So less windmills, less solar panels. and so on and so forth. And it helps us as a state, as a community, as an environment. If we're not spending as much on electricity or gas, they have to provide us less, and we're using less of our natural resources.
All right. Makes sense when you put it all together, but sometimes I want to sell you less of what I produce. Seems like to a business owner in particular, a real disconnect. So thanks for connecting the dots. Appreciate it. Brian, let's wrap up with this. The state budget is currently, it's in a very interesting place. We normally would be talking about the next state budget that starts in October. But there's a lot of money kind of swishing around our state right now from the federal government. What's going on the budget issue?
You have two really big pieces that are moving right now. One is the regular budget, and that process, back in the Snyder administration, usually we had it done by May or June. It's been pushed off a little bit more here in divided government, and so that the regular budget process for what happens after October 1st is in full swing right now. But there's also billions of additional dollars that are coming to state and local governments from the American Rescue Plan. And so all of that is being negotiated right now. There are definitely significant differences in the approach that the administration and the legislature want to take, but they are actually working together, negotiating around the same table. It actually looks a little more likely that they'll make some progress on this than it has in a long time. Several business pieces that we're looking for. We want the unemployment insurance trust fund shored up. We want, actually there's a really cool, we'll have a representative on here pretty soon to talk about it, but an interesting concept of instead of paying people not to work, incenting people to work. So I think there's an interesting concept that's been inserted into this process in the business support part that could really move the needle on available workforce. So I think there will be some items in the budget that we have a high amount of interest in, although most of it is, I think you should expect will go to schools and general government operations, and they'll have more to work with than they ever had, literally, in the history of Michigan.
Yep. Well, we will continue to track the budget, and we've got plenty of time to dig into that one, I think, as it goes along. Thanks for joining us today. I do want to mention there's a webinar next week on cybersecurity and data privacy. I know that you have plenty to worry about, and adding one more thing to your worry list. But if I could implore you, I would implore you to pay attention to this issue of cybersecurity. So many experts are saying it's not if, but when you are affected by this. And if it's not our webinar next Thursday, the 29th, between 2 and 3, find some place to get yourself educated about cybersecurity. There's lots you can do to protect yourself. So that's our tip of the day. Happy Earth Day. Join us next Monday at 3 o'clock. In the meantime, remember to wash your hands.
And don't touch your face. We'll see you next week.